All right, Tom, we are live. As we are now live, we're gonna give people a minute to join us here. But as we do that, Tom, welcome back. Tom
Happy to be here.
Swanson, everybody. For those of you joining, so Tom Swanson is one of our marketing orchestration gurus internally. He spent the last couple weeks in Ireland. So yesterday was his first day back. I think you'd been back for all of 3 hours before we had our prep call for this, and you came in mid-season form with the slides and everything just ready to roll. So very impressive.
Thank you. I owe it to being well supported by a great team with a good run of show. Pulling the slides together was easy.
Shout out to Sarah and Michelle on the back end for all their hard work getting this together. I was just really pleased with how this all came together and the number of people, Tom, that were interested in this. I mean, you and I are excited about marketing orchestration. It sounds like kind of a dorky term.
Sometimes too.
I think it's still like this as a category is still emerging a little bit in B2B. We talk a lot about it, but a little bit of a niche still in the B2B space, but the volume of people that are here as we let people join, if you are joining us already, see a bunch of folks already here. If you get in the chat, just introduce yourself, like, where you're joining us from. We'd love to say hello. And, from here in the overcast, shocker, but still beautiful Pacific Northwest. Excited to be here.
Yeah. Everything shines when it's rainy.
I don't mind it. I don't mind it at all. I think what some of the best PR of all time was Seattle convincing people that it rains here all the time, and it doesn't. It's really more overcast all the time.
I moved here from Arizona, and I went 5 months without seeing a cloud, and it was the worst.
Yeah. So Steve, sub-freezing Boston, Jody, sunny Colorado. Colorado's another place like Denver. Tell you what, you get a lot of sun there in Colorado and Denver. You get a lot of sunny days. So Ryan, Harry, Ram, good to see you. Ellie, good to see you. And thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. We got a lot of content, so I'm going to start getting into it. This is being recorded. So this entire on-demand recording available to everybody afterward. Tom has some slides, which you are definitely going to want if you're thinking about worrying about marketing orchestration internally in your organization. So I'm going to hand it off to Tom in a little bit. We want to make this as interactive as possible. If you have a question or comment, we're going to have the ability to throw that up on screen. See, Jody, you're now part of the live show. Jody from Drury Waterloo in Canada. Hi to Canada. Hi to what I think, isn't Waterloo basically South Detroit, or is Detroit North Waterloo? Am I getting Windsor? I'm getting that screwed up, but Windsor is actually next to Detroit. Anyway, if you have a question or comment, we'll be able to see that. I want to make this as interactive as we can. I want to make this as useful as we can for you. So as we go through sort of what we think of as marketing orchestration and the mechanics behind it, we'll get into it. Want to make sure we're addressing what you care about as well. Tom, marketing orchestration is the solution, but every solution is only relevant if there's a problem. And the problem is what Gartner has referred to as collaboration drag. And I liked the way that they've characterized this. And here's where this is a problem: is that as you get to more complex go-to-market motions, as you have bigger teams trying to get things done together, bigger marketing teams, let alone cross-functional go-to-market teams, as your technology stack and integrations of campaigns across tech stack gets more complicated. And then, God forbid, you've got teams working across time zones and different work times. It's 2/3 of the companies that Gartner surveyed report a high level of collaboration drag across major programs, and they say that those with high collaboration drag are 37% less likely to exceed objectives. Or in other words, Tom, why are our programs always late? Why are we always running behind? Why
don't we know how long things
get done? Right. Yeah. So we're going to get right into it. I'm going to keep track. I'll be your ringleader today. Tom is the deep subject matter expert. Tom, I'll let you just start to share and start to present. I'll keep track of the chat, and we'll keep going. But thanks everyone for being here, and off we go.
Yeah, let me let me pull that up. So as I figure StreamYard's sharing thing out here. Okay. Cool.
Carrie, you're right about summer in Seattle. We know that's got to be the best kept secret. Basically, for July 5th through late September, that's it.
Let's see. So are y'all taking a look at what's holding your workflow back? Matt, are you seeing that?
See it. You got it.
Awesome. Okay, great. All right, cool. This is one of my favorite presentations to give, and you're all going to get to see my minimalist philosophy on slide design here. So today I'm talking about what's holding your workflow back is the title of the webinar. But really what it comes down to, and this is in reference to the problem, Matt, that you mentioned, if you're feeling like, oh shit, our process drags, this is a good spot for you to be. That's usually the impetus for a lot of these discussions, and where we get started with it. So I'm going to go ahead and dive in. Would love to see in the chat some answers to this question. This is something I'm very curious about, but generally speaking, if you're here, you probably have bottlenecks. What's causing the bottlenecks in your orchestration? Where are you seeing it? Where's it showing up?
I check all that apply on here, right? Like it could be all of the above. It could be 1, 3, 4. Would love to hear where you're at. And for those of you that are here, we'll sort of aggregate these answers together and sort of share it afterward. But, would love to hear where you think it is. Carrie, thank you for being honest. All of these, some may be worse than others. But
man, everyone has an opinion. Oh, I should have put that one on there. That is a very common one. Very common.
What did I see was the highest paid person, the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion is sort of what kind of, drives the boat sometimes.
I like not always clear who owns what, and the review group always grows. That honestly, Jody, that one in particular, reviews being like the group growing. We're going to talk about boundaries today. And when it comes to review process, boundaries are really, really, really key. Good. Love to see it. Too many decisions
by committee. Yeah.
All right.
Megan, I think you feel seen. Hopefully the sales team. Yep. Common.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Excellent. Look, it's all over the board. There's a reason that we put up so many options with this. Too many cooks in the kitchen, very common. But let's get into it. Good. By the way, if you have questions or you want to talk about something in specific, chime in and just put it in the chat. We'll see it. I'd rather this be interactive. I have a decent chunk of slides here. I don't need to get through all of them. If we can answer some specific questions for you all and create value that way, I think that's going to be, a great way to go. So feel free to dive in.
I'll keep track of those. I'll interrupt you when you need to. I'm just going to keep highlighting some of these comments as we go, but I don't want you to keep going.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so let's just start at the start. This is the first thing that we do. And if you're really trying to figure out, the reason I like to ask that question first, where are you seeing these issues or what do you anticipate will be the bottlenecks, is because this is what you feel that ultimately gets you going. And we start out with mapping out. Now, I love this this particular little diagram. I had AI draft up a marketing treasure map for me, and this is what it came up with. I wanted to include it just because it's so weird. The Sea of Opportunity is my favorite, but I love the Bay of Brand and I love ROI Ridge. It's so close, but it's just not quite there. But we usually start with a map. So here's our first little piece of practical advice. This is our scorecard for how we evaluate marketing orchestration. If you want this, feel free to email me or email Matt after the presentation. I'm more than happy to send this your way. We give this away for free, so you can take a look at it. But we essentially break it out. There's our email addresses. But we effectively break this out into 4 areas and then rate it on a 1 to 5 scale. We name it, initial through optimized, but it really is just a 1 to 5. First and foremost, we've got collaboration communication. That one's pretty straightforward. Just how do your teams communicate? But the big ticket item here is it's not just how does internally a team communicate, it's how do teams communicate with each other. We talk a lot about collaboration drag. It's very rare that we see the biggest pieces of collaboration drag coming up within a team. It comes up between teams far more often. That's probably the biggest. With roles and process, I think I saw lack of ownership and accountability. There it is. Thank you, Mandy. But that one, having a RACI, having defined roles and process, very important for orchestration, very important for team empowerment. Project management tools is another pretty straightforward one. Do you have it and do you use it? And then finally, what's your strategic process look like? Are people able to make decisions that align with the strategy, or are you winding up all over the place? How reactive is your strategy versus how proactive? I don't necessarily advocate for one over the other entirely, but we do try to find the ways to be reactive within a proactive strategy.
Tom, it's amazing to me how many people think of marketing orchestration just as that third area. It's just, I have a tool, so we're doing it, right?
Yeah.
It's like back in the day where like, we have Marketo, therefore we're doing marketing automation, or we have 6 Sense, therefore we're doing ABX, right? Having a tool is great, right? But like how you use that tool matters, and like the context of the communication cycles, the roles and process, the alignment. If that doesn't exist, the tool can actually be counterproductive.
Yeah, we've actually seen that like a number of times where people will have project management tools, but because it's not accepted by everybody, or one team uses a different tool. Like I've seen, oh shoot, what was it? Like Kapost being used for one team, and then Jira for another team, and then Smartsheet for a third team, all within the same organization, and trying to like instead of saying, hey folks, let's try and get all on one, like let's gather some requirements and figure out how we can get onto one tool. It was, how do we integrate these 3 different tools? So it's just massively overcomplicating the process when it really didn't need to be. But yeah, most of the time people think it's just project management. And I will say having a dedicated project management team is very, very helpful for marketing orchestration generally. But it's much more than just how you manage the project. It's kind of how the team works together. Yeah, faster messing up. That's a great way to put it. Although faster, not always. Sometimes the mess ups don't show up until way later. So let's get into it. The first thing I like to do in general is pull up the scorecard, show people the scorecard. But what I'm really trying to do is map out, what does the workflow actually look like? We have a nice, very pretty little 6-step thing here. Ideally, this is what everybody's workflow looks like. It just is one line. It goes right through from start to end. We all know that's not the case. But this is, where my head goes when I think workflow. So we map it out. We get the context. This is what it looks like first. And here's the process that we go through. I just want to share this with everybody so you all know. I start with the leadership, and I hear, hey, what are the problems? Where are things at? What's the leadership's perspective? And the reason I start with the leadership is because I like to then go to the individual contributors, the people on the front line, and ask them the questions about what we heard from the leadership. How accurate are we? Like, is the leadership's perspective of what's going on? And we'll talk about kind of the iceberg of ignorance. I think I have that slide later on, but if not, I'll talk about it. But effectively, do we hear from the front line the same things that we hear from the leadership? Usually we don't. But once we have that, then we draw everything out. Okay, cool. This is what we heard from leadership. This is what we heard from the individual contributors. Here's how we think things work. We then bring it back to the individual contributors and say, cool, do we have this right? Does this map look good? Have we missed anything? Have we misweighted anything? Is there anything that's not included that needs to be? And then we bring that back to the leadership to try to give them a realistic view of what the process really looks like from the frontline perspective. So creating that alignment between the two is really important. Now, most marketers here are going to be very familiar with the bow tie. That's why I chose this model or chose this little graphic. But generally speaking, what we're really looking to do is get context and have people weigh in so that we can then convert that into buy-in for why this change needs to happen in the first place, and what it should look like and where the issues really are.
Well, and sometimes, Tom, I want to bring up Ruby's question here, where sometimes the problem is that there's too damn many people involved in the process, right? And so if everybody wants to be able to weigh in on something to approve it, like when you're at the 5 foot level, you're like, oh, this person would be valuable. This person's input would be valuable. But part of the process of stepping back and inventorying where you've got is to say, if you're going to have this many people involved, it's going to take you this long. You can't see my hands are so far away. You're going to take you forever to get campaigns to market. And even just enumerating that, it's like, is that an acceptable timeline for us? And if it's not, some things got to get cut. So just calling it what it is and saying, how do we create a process that's more efficient, that's adequate enough to make sure we've got some quality assurance, but increases the agility and speed to market as well.
Yeah, we'll get to RACI in a bit here. But we've defined, like, we like to do RACI. You can do DACI if it's like an ongoing process, is usually the better. I mean, there's RACI and DACI. Those are kind of the two. I hate how close they made those acronyms because the two are totally different. But we typically use RACI because we're talking about project management here. Responsible, accountable, consultant, informed. The accountable party is the one that's accountable to the outcomes. That's the person who needs to be reviewing and approving. Generally speaking, Ruby, if everybody has to have their eyes on it, then what you have is a role and clarity problem. Everybody thinks it's their role to review this thing. Everybody feels accountable to the outcome. my guess is that in your organization, it's not clear who ultimately gets held accountable when something doesn't perform as it should. And, at the same time, who gets held accountable when it does perform as well as it should, who gets lauded and whatever. But the point being, if you don't have that clarity, everybody feels like they need to weigh in because it's all of their necks on the line if something goes wrong. So you need to make it very clear who is the final decision maker and have that person be the accountable party if you want to get anything done faster. If they see something on social or email go out and never seen it, they get really nervous. Yeah, I feel that. I mean, honestly, again, where is that nervousness coming from? Is it coming from do they feel as though they are accountable to something, and where is that pressure coming from? Because if it's not clear who should be held accountable when something goes out that's wrong or incorrect, then everybody's going to feel nervous about it. But let's keep going.
Yeah, so Tommy, I don't want to belabor this, but like this isn't just like process improvement. This is change management. And the change management has to account for people and feelings, right? And you get into sort of like, if I'm not reviewing this, I'm not worthy, or if I don't review this, I'm not important enough. I mean, like you really get to that level sometimes to be able to unlock the why to get to the optimal workflow.
Yeah.
And Heather's right. It's also it's trust as well. Yeah, keep going.
So mapping. Once we get done with this, we usually wind up with something more like this. So we've gone from our nice little 1-track to a 2-track one. This isn't even that complicated of a workflow. Like if you really dug into this is pretty straightforward. It's not that many steps, which I think is funny to say with this text so small you can't even read it. But this is a pretty straightforward workflow, but it looks really intimidating. And we usually wind up with multiple entry scenarios, a few fast tracks, different terminators. And FYI, we use business process notation or business process mapping and notation. This is a BPMN. It's Google it. It's a language for making workflows. It's very good. I like it a lot. But we wind up with something a little bit more complex. We also map out an ecosystem, which looks something like this. This is usually paired with an org chart. So, you have your org chart, who owns what's the hierarchy look like. But the other piece that we do is put together an overall ecosystem. How is information flowing? In this case, this is for a campaign. So with respect to producing a campaign, what's the ecosystem look like? Who touches it? What do they do with it? What information flows where and how often? All those things are kind of laid out here. There was a lot of teams involved in this. This was a really big marketing team. Yeah, to Matt's point, we'll send out these slides will be available so you can dig in and look more deeply if you want to like really get into it. But this is our typical template for what a kind of multi or a cross-functional with an internal agency campaign planning and execution team would probably look like. You can take out any of these boxes that you don't have or whatever, but this is a pretty nice template for it. So we build out the ecosystem to actually speak to the relationship between the teams so it's nice and crystal clear. Lot of mapping. If you're curious about mapping, I actually go into all of these and how to make them in these videos. They're on our YouTube channel and our blog. I like to do video blogs rather than written ones. I think it's just a bit more fun and I can get through it. And I try to get through it in 5 minutes. It usually takes closer to 20, not to intimidate you. The videos are capped at 10. So go ahead, take a look if you're looking to make these kind of maps yourself or if you want more detail on that. But here's the deal. Matt mentioned change management. Folks don't think about this enough. Good, effective marketing processes and orchestration leads to a better quality of life for everybody and better talent retention. I usually open this presentation up by saying the most important thing a business does is hire. The second most important thing a business does is manage change. Would love to say managing change is number one, but it's not. It's number two. How you hire is number one. The talent is so important. But if you're not retaining the talent, then hiring them isn't going to do you any good either. And a good process that people like working in is going to retain your talent better than just about anything else, except for maybe pay. So there you go. If you don't manage the change well, it'll kill your process. And if your process is poorly designed, your talent's going to leave. All right, we got a question from Ryan. For smaller team, you all can read it. Which is recommended detail. Yeah, so this is for smaller teams. We would typically go a little less on the like hardcore detailed process template, and we would try to get to testing faster. The thing with a smaller team is you'll get feedback quicker, so you can move through iterations of it faster. Whereas with a larger team, any change to the workflow is gonna affect people in unexpected ways. We saw this with a team we were working with that was over 200 people on the marketing team spread across multiple functions, where if we made a change in one function, it would impact the other one and other ones in unpredictable ways, and we couldn't feasibly get the entire team together into one room to talk about it. So the big difference being, for a smaller team, we would probably go a little bit less of a structured workflow because you can be more agile and figure things out. It's not to say that you shouldn't document all of the steps and what needs to go into it. You should, but doing that upfront is going to be onerous with a really small team when you could just get to testing faster, provided that everybody's willing to give candid feedback and talk about it quickly. Does that make sense? I hope that answered your question. But yeah, there you go. I would go a little less on the documentation, a little more on the agility, and just focus on testing and iteration for smaller teams. So next question. With respect to change management, how do you feel like you're managing change? It's got a nice little 1, 2, or 3 here. 3 being the worst. You can put it in the chat.
Throw your answers in the chat here. Just curious to see sort of where we lean. I'm guessing 2s to 3s, maybe.
That's what we typically would see.
Yeah. Paul's being honest. Yeah. Ooh, Megan. Look at that.
This is about what we would expect to see. Like, change is hard, but people do it all the time. It's not impossible. It's not rocket science. But the trick with it is often the buy-in side of it and getting people to engage. So I have a few tips on that. So here is some help figuring out how to do it effectively. I love diagrams generally, so there are going to be a few of them on here. Visualization is very fun. One of the things that I like to do when we're coming into a change is to figure out where we're going to run into problems. I typically do this across these 6 areas. So Steve, I see your question. We'll get to it in a moment. There are usually, like, if we can figure out where changes are going to come up, it's one of these 6 areas. It's either a personal, like it's a problem with the people involved, or it's a problem at the organizational level. And here's what they are. This is a dispersion chart. It's like a star chart is what it's typically called. But effectively, we chart them 1 to 5 along each of these axes. Now, it might look something like this. So in this case, we've got a lot of different communication styles, but pretty aligned personality, pretty aligned interests. Requirements are about 50% aligned. There's varying capacity. The important thing to note here is this doesn't mean there's no capacity. If there's no capacity among all of the teams, just take the change slower or punt it. If there's a lot of capacity on some teams, but no capacity on others, then some teams are going to move faster in the change than others. You're going to run into problems there. It's about how dispersed the teams are, not is capacity super limited. So it usually winds up looking something like this. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's really focused on change, not necessarily marketing orchestration. But we would typically see something like this. With this, we can anticipate that we need to align communication styles. We need to bring everybody into one channel in order to track the change, or we need to fully embrace the dispersed communication and have somebody responsible for compiling at the end. I don't typically like that option. I'd rather everybody be on the same channels. But we know we're going to run into issues with capacity, with change tolerance, and with communication style. We also know that some people are misaligned on their requirements, and we need to deal with that. So this just helps us figure out where do we direct our efforts when it comes to change management. And then I'm going to breeze through this, but again, the slides will be available. So if you want to look specifically at any of these, here's how we assess them. These are the things that we look for. These are the questions that we ask. Really truncated. Obviously, I'd love to dig deeper into any one of these questions, and I could talk about all of them for hours. But generally speaking, this is what we're looking at. So when it comes to the personal ones, comp style, personality, and interests, this is what we look for. These are the questions we ask. And then when it comes to the organizational ones, requirements, capacity, and change tolerance, or change intolerance, depending, here are the things that we look for. I would say change tolerance is the one that people run into the most in marketing as an issue. Requirements and capacity. Capacity is always limited. Everybody's busy. Requirements, people can generally get on the same page for what they want to change to do. But the trick is, how tolerant are people of changes? If they've been in a constant state of change, they're going to be intolerant to more. You got to finish some things before you can bring in more. And generally speaking, if you've ever read the book Who Moved My Cheese, folks tend to struggle with change, especially when it's a lot of changes one after the other. All right. So that's it for mapping. Typically, we map all of those things out. We look at the workflows, and then we try to figure out how difficult is it going to be to impact any of these changes. Yeah, there you go. So now we're going to talk about trust and feedback as the other piece. Team culture really matters when it comes to orchestration. And we've got a few blog posts in the next week or so coming out about how marketing orchestration impacts talent retention and what to look for there. So keep an eye out for those. But yeah, what are some workarounds as well? When appropriate. I mean, workarounds can damage process integrity, so be kind of careful about it. But before we go any further, I want to talk just real quick to Steve, to your point. How do you bring these topics up without releasing the antibodies to change? It's very difficult to do this. Oftentimes, it's not about avoiding the antibodies entirely. It's about getting the antibodies out into the open and talking about them. It isn't necessary. Like, people are going to be resistant to change no matter what. Overcoming that resistance is more important than just trying to avoid it entirely. So if there's resistance to the change, if people are putting out the antibodies, we need to understand why. If we're going to keep the doctor talk going, why is there an immune response to change at all? Why is it seen as a threat to the overall organization and the body system? So that's the bigger question for me. I try not to avoid the resistance. I try to confront it head on and get it out in the open so we can talk about it. Okay, hang on. I got to click back over here. So another question. We've got a few of these. I think this is the second to last one, so then you can all ease off the keyboard. So do your teams work well together and collaborate, or are you seeing a lot of collaboration drag? And specifically, the team, not internally within a team, but the teams working with other teams. Like, do you find friction when it comes to cross-functional collaboration?
I would think we see a lot of threes. I think it's complicated for a lot of companies, big, small, old, young, newer companies. I mean, as the go-to-market motions become more complex, yeah, twos and threes for sure.
Yeah, this is really common. Look, there's a great line out of Chip and Dan Heath's Switch. If you haven't read it, very, very good. One of my favorite books on change. But effectively, it's what looks like resistance is often a lack of clarity. If people are resistant to change, it's likely that they're unclear on what they're supposed to be doing and how they're supposed to be collaborating. I would be shocked to hear at the folks who are answering to if their organizations feel that they have a clear sense of inputs and outputs for each step of the marketing process. That's where the silos, like there's, everybody wants to break down silos. That's like the big buzz phrase. But people are always going to want to work on their thing and take it in. It's the key goal is to have touch points where that thing comes out into the open before it's done, where folks can talk about it and connect with it. And that's one of the key points of a workflow that we put in is where are those collaborative moments that need to occur. And it gets really tricky because folks don't want to have collaboration scripted. And rightly so. I mean, you don't want to have to say you must collaborate at exactly this point, but at the same time, if it's not clear what the inputs and outputs are and where those should occur, then the collaboration is unlikely to happen naturally. This is why having a project management team is really good and a worthwhile investment, even just one PM, because that PM can be accountable for making sure that the collaboration is happening and the people who needed to be consulted on a particular deliverable were consulted. Yeah, Gwen, that's an excellent point. I'm curious what you mean by goals aren't well enough intertwined. When we say goals, are we talking about like outcomes that we're trying to achieve? Yeah, another important one. We have solved that problem, Carrie, with the RACI, really, is where are people consulted and where do they get involved? And then what does that consultation look like? When do you bring in the production teams to be able to talk about whether or not the planning teams ideas and plans are feasible. That's been one of the biggest challenges. It's just around feasibility for the web team to be able to say, no, we can't do that. Like, that doesn't make sense. We don't have that functionality. It would take too long to build it. We would need to do all this UX testing just so that folks can understand each other's perspective more. Has been really, really helpful. But let's keep going because we are already at 12:30. This is something that we do really early on. And it's like, again, this is a very simple meeting to have that has a lot of weight to it. Usually it takes maybe 30 minutes to get to number 3 here. I like to bring all of the stakeholders that we talk to, individual contributors, leadership, and everybody in between into a room. I do this typically with an opt-out method. It's very important to do opt-out instead of opt-in. If somebody wants to be involved in the change, it should be assumed that everybody wants to, and then people should opt out. If they have to opt in, they might miss the email. They'll feel like they weren't included. If it's opt-out, they can say, you know what? I'm happy with you all handling this. Go for it. Just tell me what you need me to do. So that's the way I try to do this, but I bring all of the stakeholders who don't opt out together. And I say, okay, this is what we think the challenges are going to be. So going back to that dispersion chart of how we think about the difficulty of the change, we're misaligned on requirements, and capacity is really all over the place. So these are the challenges we expect to come up against. And then we have everybody state their expectations out loud. It's very, very important to do it out loud. They have to say it. There's something about saying something in front of a group of people that does some kind of weird magic on folks' brains. I used to study education. That's my background, was in education research. It's very fun. I liked it a lot. Marketing also very fun. But when people say things out loud and they weigh in and everybody has to agree, they have to speak it in front. It just gets people to a deeper level of candor, and folks are more comfortable than saying what they really think. So then you write them all down and send them in a recap. That's the end of the meeting. Very simple meeting to put together. Gets difficult if folks clam up, but the idea that everybody states their expectations for the project out loud tends to move people and just gets any areas of misalignment right out into the open. So when we talked about how do you avoid the change antibodies, this is where we dig into it. Okay, Steve, how do you create comfort for more junior folks? Okay, we're going to talk about psychological safety. That's coming. So be ready for that. I will address that question when we get there. The last thing I do is I share a roadmap. So for the project, I say, okay, here's the requirements, here's the roadmap, and then I point out where the requirements show up within the roadmap. Very important to do that, so that folks can see, hey, these are the things we're going to deal with first. This other stuff is on the roadmap. It's there. We heard you. But we need to deal with these other things first. I mean, it takes a little bit of finagling there, and there is the possibility that somebody's going to feel like their piece has been pushed down a line. But this is business. Sometimes you got to prioritize. And strategy is about trade-offs. So what can we do now versus what are we going to need to push and address in the future? All right. I said we would talk about psychological safety, and here it is. This is Google's 5-key model for effective teams. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's a nice piece of work. I like the little diagram, but there's a reason that the number 1 is psychological safety. Another very important book that I would highly recommend is Crucial Conversations, which also talks a lot about psychological safety and the importance of it in having these conversations. Steve, there isn't an easy way to remedy what you have said here. I wish there was, to make junior folks feel more comfortable. But one of the things that's going to bring out the junior folks who are stars and really shine is if they can get over that and speak candidly about what they're feeling. Now, the trick is you have to show them that there isn't reprisal for being candid. If everybody comes into it from the perspective of we all want this to work, and this, we're going to put our ego aside. We're not going to be precious about the work. We're going to talk candidly about it. And then they speak candidly and there's no reprisal. You're going to reinforce that value. That is really important. But if they see any kind of punishment as a result of speaking up, then you've probably lost that person forever. It's just kind of a truism here. Like, we need to establish psychological safety early on, and the way that we do it is by explicitly stating, this is a safe space for giving your perspectives, your thoughts, as long as you're not attacking somebody else. I mean, you might have somebody come in and say, the web team is overly restrictive and doesn't, and maybe that's valid feedback and maybe they should hear it. But the trick is you have to separate those emotions and not have it be an attack. And if there is an attack, then you have to take the time to reestablish psychological safety in the room before you move on. You have to address it, and it's hard to do. That's why I like Crucial Conversations as a book, is because it's about how to have those difficult conversations when people are getting defensive, which can happen in situations like this. But if you know how to deal with defensiveness and you know how to get past it and to reestablish psychological safety in a room, you'll see a lot more of that candid feedback. The other piece here is a lot of baggage. If you're dealing with this problem, you probably, like the marketing orchestration problem, you probably already have baggage and mistrust between the teams. So you have to be patient with it and hold those historical issues in your mind. There isn't really an easy way around it. Trust takes time to build, but the first step to it is getting all of the expectations and thoughts up front. Get all of those requirements and all that candor out. So there we go. Last but not least here, I think this one often gets lost. We'll talk about it with roadmaps, but if you're going to put something on the roadmap, you got to do it. It can't just sit in priority 3 or 4 forever because people will lose trust. So either you put it on the roadmap or you close the loop with the team who requested it and say, yeah, we're not going to do that, but here's why. And make sure that they understand it. Because if you're just not putting if you're not closing the loop on suggestions and ideas, people are just not going to engage with the process. One thing, and I have left this out of this presentation, but it's a key point in my change management talks. Consistency is everything. Whatever you do, however you manage this, you need to be consistent about it. There really isn't a bigger point when it comes to change management. It's the most important. There are 3 topics I like to talk about: consistency, clarity, and empathy. Obviously, this is my empathy slide, but the consistency one really, really matters. So make sure you're consistent when you're putting stuff in the roadmap and you're consistently closing the loop. Oh, iceberg of ignorance. So when we're talking about how do you get people to talk, this is something that a lot of leaders don't like to hear, but this was charted back in 1989, which was subsequently the year that I was born. So Sidney Yoshida had good timing. I assume this is no longer 4%. But basically the gist of it is this: executives know 4% of the problems that are faced by the front line. In 1989, that might have been true. Probably not true now with the level of visibility that we have. But the point still stands. Executives don't know everything that's going on at the front line. And if you flip this whole thing, the front line doesn't know what's going on at the executive level. So there's a lot of misunderstanding around why things are done. And it's very important then to hear out the individual contributors and have leadership initiated pathways for feedback. Y'all are leaders. You need to go to your teams and ask them, how are things going? Where are the issues? What are the problems? It needs to come from leadership because, to your point, Steve, the junior folks aren't going to come to the leaders as often. They're going to feel, if there isn't psychological safety, and in a lot of cases there just isn't naturally, it has to be built. Junior folks are not going to come up and say, hey, I think we could be doing this way better, or hey, you need to know, here's some problems at the front line. So leadership needs to initiate that, whether it happens at the middle management level or at the top. It just needs to come from the leaders in an organization. So I just like to bring that one up. Ray Dalio, one of my favorite writers, he has a book called Principles. Again, highly recommended. My change management talks are usually based on a few key principles rather than like a model, because I think principles are much more flexible and adaptable. But he talks about radical transparency. And here's the gist. If you're doing marketing orchestration, this is a very important one to embrace. I won't spend too much time on it, but you get the idea. Like, it needs to be everything needs to be super clear. Why are you doing the things that you're doing? Why is your roadmap laid out the way that it is? If you expect people to engage with the process, the transparency needs to be absolute. And that's just the gist of it. Also, people need to know that you know. When we come back to the iceberg of ignorance, it's your team needs to know that you are aware of the issues that they have. And the best way to do that is to be transparent about why things are the way that they are and why what's not on the roadmap isn't on the roadmap. So all that really matters. All right. I promised we'd talk about boundaries. Here it is. When it comes to review processes, this is so important. I've heard review processes a lot. Too many people getting involved. Too many cooks in the kitchen. Everybody wants to have a say in everything that goes out, whether it's a social post or an ebook or whatever. Your review process, when we document this, we put it into a table and we say, okay, review stage 1, here is what's up for discussion. Usually that's your strategic stuff. It's going to be your top level, like What are we trying to accomplish with this piece of media, and is it doing that at a strategic level? Anything that's expensive to change needs to be dealt with early. Once you deal with it and go into review stage 2, all the review stage 1 stuff is off the table. It's really, really hard for people to accept that. But if you've documented it and everybody has agreed upon it, you'll have an easier time. If a strategic tier 1 change comes in tier 2 review, you're back to the front of the queue, or to the back of the queue, sorry. It's really important that the creative teams can hold these boundaries, or they're going to get overwhelmed. Planning teams are notoriously bad at holding review boundaries because they think, you know what, this isn't line, we're in tier 3. I just had this great idea. I want to totally change it up. So then they go and they say, you know what, can we do it this other way? And now you've stressed out your production team. Deadlines are getting pushed. They're having to have emergency meetings about reprioritizing their work. It's a nightmare. So the boundaries are very important. Again, that's strategic stuff at the first one. Usually the second one is in between the little tactical details, which come in tier 3, and the big strategic stuff that comes in tier 1. Obviously, for shorter pieces of content or smaller things, like if you've got a template and you're just making content from a template, maybe you only need one review phase. We've built tiered, structured review phases a lot. But the most important thing that we do in that is say, here is what can review, and here is who does the reviewing. And then here's the approver. Usually the approver is the accountable party within a RACI model. Not always, but generally speaking, we try to make it whoever's accountable is the approver. They're the ones that say this is done in tier 1, it's ready to go to tier 2. So that's how we do it. But we have no more than 2 reviewers per stage. 2 reviewers, 1 approver. And most of the time that approver is also one of the reviewers. So in reality, we really only have 2 reviewers. Yeah, that's how we do it. And I would recommend any of you do something similar. Your review process needs to be structured. An unstructured review process means that your creators are going to wind up in rough shape very quick. Let's see here. It could be FYI reviewer only. Oh, yeah. That would be like a from template was what we would call that. And we'd put that into the content taxonomy and say, okay, these are the content types that could be made from template. And if they're made from template, then the project management templates only have 1 review stage as opposed to 3. But again, be consistent. And I'll say this one last thing on boundaries. When your creative teams hold the boundaries, that should be celebrated. Even if it means something doesn't go out on time, if you're going to have trust with your creative teams, and I will say this, knowing I'm talking to a room full of planners, the planning teams are always the problem. The creative teams are rarely the issue. It's always the planning teams asking for too much or asking for changes too far down the line. So celebrate when your production teams hold their boundaries, because that means consistent SLAs and more predictable work. And while it might hurt in the short run, in the long run, if we take a longer term view, that consistency is going to mean you'll be able to get stuff out on a predictable timeline. You know, this event's coming in 2 months. You know, this brochure is going to take 1 month to make. Awesome. You've got plenty of time. But if you know the event's coming in 2 months and the brochure could take anywhere from 2 to 4 months to make because the workloads are unpredictable, you're going to be hounding people. It's going to be a huge pain in the ass and nobody's going to like working there. And then you're going to lose your talent. So moving on. I've got my cognitive load slide in here. This is just to note, when you're making changes, don't make too many changes. Every little thing that you're asking somebody to do that's different from what they would normally do is intrinsic or extraneous cognitive load. You want their cognitive load focused on the germane. You want them going deep, thinking about things deeply. So avoid those other 2. But I like to do that before this one. We ask that people simplify their workflow. That whole big workflow that I showed with SpongeBob and his eyes popping out and Patrick with the train on his head, the train whistle on his head, we boil down to this. This is what we show when we talk about the workflow with the whole team. With any individual team, we bring up their section of the workflow and we talk in depth about those specific steps. But when we're talking to everybody, we show this one. It's much easier to take in. Everybody knows that there's a bunch of steps that go into each one of these. And during the trainings that we did, we showed in project kickoff, here are the specific steps. In strategy development, here are the specific steps. But this way, when we talk about it with the whole group, people aren't overwhelmed trying to read each individual little box and figure out where they fit. But I also wanted to show this because here's our RACI. Every single step at the most detailed level is outlined in our RACI. But at the broad level, we like to show the RACIs so folks know at a high level what they're accountable to and what they're responsible for. So simplifying is very, very good for what's called shrinking the change. Again, that's from Switch, highly recommended reading. But when you shrink that change, you reduce the overall cognitive load in thinking about a change. It makes it easier for folks to take it in. So there you go. Oh, Alex makes a great point. I want to talk about that. Can we bring that question up? Having redundancy is very important in the review process. 2 people on a review step, you're right. That's great. Having one person be away isn't as much of an issue, but also have backups. You know, if Tom's away, know that Matt is his backup for review. That's just, I mean, we've run into so many places where that's not the case. Sorry, I got a tickle. I'm just getting over COVID. But anyway, there we go. Just wanted to point that out. Last but not least here, I think this is the last slide in this section. Don't sleep on governance. I need to hurry up. Have a governance model. People should know how to make changes to the approach. This is a very simple one. Feel free to take it. I please use this. It's very, very easy to do governance wrong. To have governance be every team is connected to every other team and everybody weighs in on everything. I've got a slide in this deck. It's hidden. You won't see it, where I've shown a governance model that's a big fat mess. Just make it simple, have it be easy, and make sure this is always going to be the case. The leadership team, and I'm talking directly to you marketing leaders now, needs to own the culture. Period. You need to define what the culture is that you want. If you want psychological safety, make it a priority and talk about it. If the marketing leadership team isn't aligned on what the culture needs to be, the culture is going to be whatever the teams make it. And if they're not communicating well, then the culture is going to fail. So tell people what you want the culture to be, and then figure out how do we work towards that. It's a much better way to do it. But leadership needs to own it. And then they need to communicate it out. So this is our very basic governance model. I like it simple. All right. If there's no other questions on that, let's talk about scaling and roadmaps. I'll show you a nice little, this is the last question. When you're thinking about scaling a roadmap specifically, or scaling a workflow, sorry, I'm getting my terms mixed up. What do you think is going to come up on your team? What are the issues? And workarounds are when people don't follow the intake scenarios. They try to get stuff done through back channels. That's what I mean by workarounds. It's very damaging.
And this is another check all that apply situation, right?
Oh yeah, we'll say 6 is check all that apply, or 6 is all the above. Yep, workarounds. I'm seeing workarounds. Yeah, very common. I will say for workarounds, the most common one that we see is a planning team trying to go around the planning process to just get something done and just input it into the production team. Here's another area where the production teams need to be able to hold boundaries and have to be empowered to do so. They have to be able to say it must go through this channel. When I showed that workflow, there were 2 intake scenarios. One of the intake scenarios was a regular campaign planning process. It's the one along the top. We knew that people wanted one-off pieces of content that were not associated with campaigns. That was the bottom flow. It's our one-off flow. If you want something that just needs to get done in the near term, you go through the bottom one. There's a whole intake scenario for that. It's not about avoiding every intake scenario and channeling everything through one spot. It's about knowing how your team operates and building a workflow that accommodates it. That way, your creatives can hold the boundaries without feeling like they're inhibiting people or stopping the way that the team works. And yeah, the Slack, do me a favor. Yeah, tell me about it. And those pet project asks, yeah, again, like if your executives are asking for pet projects and you have a failure of culture, that's leadership not holding the culture that they believe in, because they're thinking, hey, I've got this thing. What I want is more important. And who knows, maybe it is. But if it is, put it through the regular intake scenario. It should be able to hold up to scrutiny. Otherwise, is it really worth it? There you go. Yeah, workarounds. Thanks, Alex. Very nice. You have to stand firm. But how can you stand firm if the culture doesn't respect you for holding the boundaries? All right, let's keep going. I like to show this to executives because they usually think about it as, we'll just do the process and then it will be done and it will be perfect. No, you have to treat process like a product. It's obvious. No process is going to be feature complete on the first go through. You have to test it. Just like you would with a product, you would bring the users in, you'd do focus groups, you'd sit down and you'd talk to them, you'd survey them. Look at this process as the exact same. You can actually take Pragmatic Institute's product framework here and apply a lot of the things. It's not always one-to-one. There's no pricing, for example, but a lot of these concepts apply. You have to think about it like you would a product. This isn't going to be done the first time. So what goes on the product roadmap for the next round? And then this last point here is very, very important. Everybody wants to reboot their process and say, we're going to scrap the whole thing and start over. Don't do that. Just don't do it. Everybody hates it. Nobody likes reboots. I mean, when Spider-Man does it, it's a little bit not as bad. But when you do it with a process that affects people's lives, it's awful. And if you do it twice, then you're breaking trust, because nobody's going to believe in you after that point. It's more important that you see where the problems are and iterate than reboot the process time and time again. So resist the urge to reboot. Simply iterate. This is our roadmap. I don't usually like to break it out into a timeline, but we will if we have very, very specific things. But generally speaking, it's hard to predict how long any of these things are going to take in a team that's currently adopting a new process, because you don't know what's going to come down the marketing pipeline. You don't know what executive pet projects might come up from the CEO. So if you put this to a timeline and then you start to miss milestones, it runs into issues with trust. But if you say, hey, these are our priority items, you have a bit more flexibility. Now you have to be diligent about actually doing these things, which is where a time-bound roadmap can be better. So if that's how you operate and you've got that kind of predictability, awesome, put timelines on it. But I don't do it in our template because that's not the case for every company. So anyway, I hate the fact that I have 3 priority 1 items here, but sadly I had to do it. I would say 1 at most, or 1 is best. It's priority 1. It should be just 1. 2 is okay. 3 is the most I'm willing to do at any one point, because if you got more than 3 priorities, you got no priorities. And finally, just don't let 3 and 4 become a graveyard. Make sure things are moving up the priority list. The amount of time something has sat in 3 or 4 should be factored into how it gets prioritized. Otherwise, people are just going to look at 3 and 4 as a graveyard, and if their stuff is in there, it might as well not be on the roadmap at all. And I'm sorry, I'm going to go a little bit quicker, but here it is. Test as early as possible. When it comes to marketing orchestration, this cannot be understated. I said it's not feature complete. It won't be. You will need to test it. We like to do this in a limited setting first, and then do it agile. Test early and often. If you get too tied to specific success metrics, your tests are going to miss out on a lot of the insight that you can get. And then don't just look at quantitative. Look at qualitative. Talk to your people, talk to individual contributors. You could design, but you'll find issues way faster if you create an MVP and just test it out. We like to do this with small campaigns that have limited visibility. If you test a new process with your big launch campaign, you're going to struggle. CEO is going to see it. They're going to be like, what's going on here? Why is this struggling like that? So pick a smaller campaign or a smaller piece of content and test with that first. Get the low-hanging fruit out of the way. And then once you have dealt with all of the small or all of the immediate bugs, then scale it up. That's how we do it. And I just don't think there's a better way. I mentioned qualitative and quantitative metrics. Milestones are great for qualitative metrics, so that if you don't hit your quantitative goals, you still are moving forward. It's very important that folks see, hey, just because we didn't hit the SLAs that we wanted doesn't mean we aren't making progress. So have those milestones. And make sure that you are doing both, because the milestones still matter, and hitting the milestones is something to be celebrated. And then reinforce it with rewards. So we talked about culture and how do you get people to actually do it. Specifically, when it comes to candor, celebrate candor. Here are a few options or examples of rewards. I personally like public positive feedback, but private constructive feedback. Most people like to receive feedback that way. So, hey, Matt, awesome job on that thing in front of everybody. But if, hey, Matt, we could have done a better job at this. Here's what it looks like. Do that in your one-on-ones. And also, when you celebrate those wins publicly, it anchors. So that's what we want to do. I think that might be the end. Yes, that is. Cool.
In the nick of time. Well, for those of you that stuck around to the end, look, this is not, if this were easy, everyone would do it. And I think you get a sense for some of the complexity of doing this. I was at a conference last spring, and watched a presentation of how SAP has completely transformed their organization by applying these principles. And with SAP, it was like a 2-3 year process. So, you got to have some patience and know that this isn't just like develop a workflow and email it to everybody and think it's going to stick. And I think like Tom, I mean, for just as we wrap up here, and we can maybe throw the scorecard back up. We'll make sure we get a copy of the scorecard to everybody, just to sort of self-assess where you're at, right? And sort of where are the places where you're strong, places for growth. What do you recommend for people that, I mean, this could be overwhelming and intimidating to look at all of this at once. Yeah. Where and how do people get started?
I mean, if I had to pick one spot, I'd say sit down and talk to your teams. Like they're just, if you're looking to get started anywhere, oftentimes the problem comes down to communication. I mean, it's like business 101. Communication is the most important thing when you're in terms of skills. What's the most important thing for a team to do? I think you should be looking at the slide deck. I got the scorecard back up. I would say start there. Collaboration and communication is the first thing to look at. And the only way to get a sense for where that's at is to sit down and talk to those people. Steve, you want to see the last slide again? Matt, do you mind if I switch over to that real quick?
Go for it. Yeah, okay. So I know we've got just a couple minutes left here. Give everybody a chance to get a little potty break for those of you joining us live before your next meeting. And yes, I have young kids, so I can't stop saying potty. But someday I will. I'm gonna throw Tom's email address back up here, and if you have any questions on any of this, I think Michelle and Sarah, we're gonna get the recording of this to everybody. We're going to get a link to the slide deck to everybody so you can see all the tools and frameworks. If you want any of those, again, let us know. Feel free to email Tom directly for any of that as well. But just really appreciate it. I mean, just very impressed with how many people are here, very impressed with how many people sort of care about this. I mean, this is a complex challenge for companies as they grow, but I don't think our go-to-market motions are going to get any easier, Tom. I think that the complexity of how this works, the complexity of driving marketing orchestration, especially now that we have AI and are trying to adopt that across these different processes, I think this is really going to separate sort of the winners and losers on the marketing go-to-market front moving forward. Those that really embrace the internal change, processes, and systems required to do this well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I wish I could say this is how you should do your workflow. It would be cool to be able to do that kind of a presentation, but it's about how you manage the change and how you test and grow it. Like there isn't a one size fits all for this. It really depends on the team, the people involved, the culture, and it needs to be form fit. If you try to do like, hey, this is what company X is doing, and now we're going to do the exact same thing the exact same way, it will fail. Every team is different. Every group of people is different. And so that's why the change management piece, I can't stop talking about it, because it's about adaptability and flexibility to the specific moment and the people.
Well, Tom, you're going to have to stop talking about it now because we're out of time for today. You can talk about it again next time. We'll do another version. Just appreciate Alex, Kahala, Ellie, Scott, Steve, Michelle. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We will make sure everyone has a copy of this. There will be shareable links. So Carrie and others, if you want to share this with others, feel free to do so. And for those of you on the SaaS fiscal year, February through January, what are you doing here? Go fail something. Go close something to finish the year strong. Appreciate y'all being here, and look forward to seeing y'all again soon. Thanks again, Tom. You're a legend.
Yep.
See you guys.